Thank you, Lee. Thank you to all of our speakers for really, I think, setting the stage. We have about 30 minutes for discussion and obviously lots of big questions here, and I would encourage everyone to come up to the microphone. I'll start off here with a question to Mary, or anyone can chime in. I think you highlighted nicely in your talk some of the challenges with a broader rollout of a flexibility and surgical training paradigm unless we can let people leave after they pass that exam after their 4th year and then go and do their, I like capstone training better than terminal training because we're always training for life, but go on to their capstone training experience someplace else, and maybe that's integrated as their final year, maybe it's not, it's complicated obviously, but otherwise I worry that we really will be limiting residents who happen to be at a program that doesn't have the capacity to offer those experiences. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually was one that we deliberated at our very first foundational meeting when we were discussing this, was could we, in addition to studying this, get some kind of permission from both the board and the RRC to be a consortium where residents could rotate among our programs to have this opportunity. We got a real cold shoulder from the RRC when we suggested that, so we said, well, let's just try to launch and see what happens. Maybe we would get sort of airborne, we could revisit that issue. We're only our 2nd year into data collection, and we haven't pushed for it, but I do think that would definitely be key. As a person who's tried to help craft the schedule, I can tell you it's really important that you have that flexibility. I'll also tell you that there are some residency programs that don't have as many fellowships among our consortium members, and some of those residencies were a little bit hesitant to participate in our study because their residents didn't want to be sort of locked into perhaps having to do their fellowship at that program. So it's not, their participation is not contingent on staying at their program for a fellowship. I'll also say, sort of as a corollary to that, maybe this flexible training option and the eligibility at the end of the 4th year for the QE is going to be limited to a certain number of programs, and maybe we're going to end up with different residency programs that serve different purposes, and maybe there will be some that don't really participate in this subspecialty tracking. I personally think that would be a real shame. I think that's going to set up a haves and a have-nots kind of issue among residency programs, and I hope we can find a solution that doesn't lead us to that. I think it will be divisive to the surgical community, especially surgical educators, if we end up with that.
Agreed. Lee?
I might ask Joe just exactly what's the source. It's always fun to trace these sources of rules back, and the non-migratory 5th year, what would it take to change that, and where did that initially come from?
So I'd have to go back farther in history than my relationship with the board, so I don't know the answer to that question. I think the issues that it brings to mind are sort of trust between programs. So if you're going to take someone, and really whoever has them in their capstone years is going to have their name associated with them. So do you trust someone from another program who's had them for 4 years or for the bulk of their training? It adds a large element of uncertainty, although I do tend to agree that over time we're going to have to migrate to that. And I like the plan of working within existing rules before you start breaking rules. I know that's not your style. That is my style. I'm not sure that I agree that it's wrong to have 2 different types of residencies. So, it's kind of what goes around comes around. In the 1980s when Frank was head of the RRC, they got rid of about half the programs in the country because they were community hospital-based programs with 1 or 2 residents who were learning only general surgery, and they weren't following a kind of academic pathway, and they weren't subject to the same standardization. So they decimated isn't the right word because that's only reduced by 1/10, but they really blew up the surgical training paradigm, and now we're poised to adopt DO residencies into the general surgery training pathway. Most DO residencies put their residents into the community. Most of them are quite small. That's a group of people that are willing to serve a population that's currently underserved, which is the people who want to do general surgery in a country where we don't have enough general surgeons. So I'm not sure that we should dismiss the idea of having pathways for people who want to do that, DO or otherwise, and pathways for people who want to do something different.
Okay, first microphone.
Hi, Don Seltzer from Indianapolis, and listening to Dr. Beiske and Dr. Klingensmith's responses, maybe I already know the answer to this question, but when do we consider workforce development and the need for these trainees for society, if not now, because clearly it's very early in the inception of these flexible training paradigms, when do we consider it? And then who, Dr. Swanstrom's last slide with 7 or 8 different participants in the discussion, who would be responsible for that oversight?
So I'm going to take a big sidestep on that. That question comes up a lot. Much of graduate medical education is funded by the government. That would be the lever arm for controlling that. So we don't have a lot of impact on that. And it's not part of our national culture. I happen to come from a family of English majors. Note my definition of the word decimation for you. For every 100 English PhDs, there's one job. So it's not controlled in really any arena. It is controlled by market forces. We're seeing that with pediatric surgery right now. So when I was a resident, there were 17 pediatric surgery fellowships alternating with 18. One program took people every other year. It was the most competitive training in the country. They weren't paid particularly well, but about 4 years ago, the entering salary for a finishing pediatric surgery resident was $400,000. That had market forces related to reimbursement for hospitals for having neonatal ICUs and the requirement for having a pediatric surgeon. So now there are 50 training programs. And there's a real quality issue with their finished residents, and their salaries are falling. So now they're talking about cutting them back. So it's in our country, it's going to be market forces. I do not see anything coming anytime soon that's going to address with a big, nice, in the public interest overview to direct surgical training. That's not necessarily right, but it's honest.
Just from an additional perspective, now that I work in France, which is different and which does have a migratory 5th year of residency training, so our chief residents go all over the country, and it actually works pretty well. It's competitive. If you're a top resident, you get into the best programs, and if all the HPB programs are filled, you find something else to do. And likewise, needs assessment is done by the government. Medical training is totally free, but you do have to go where the government tells you for 2 years to pay back your society for putting you through medical school. I'm not sure how well that works. It's highly competitive. It's based on your scoring, how well you do, which is the only incentive they really have to do well. Because if you want to go to Paris to do your training or your practice, then you have to be pretty good.
If I could just throw one other thing out to address that question. One of the roles I get to serve on the American Board of Surgery is a chair of General Surgery Advisory Council, and we're actually working with the Shep Center at UNC very early in a discussion about how we can work together. They have some really powerful workforce data. In fact, a lot of the workforce projection stuff that is in the literature has come from them. We're trying to figure out what general surgeons really do in practice, and you'd think we know that, but we really don't, and especially how the recent trends in specialization have affected that group, and see if we can do some future projecting. As Joe says, until the government steps in, there's probably not a real unified effort to do this, but just to try to inform some of the questions of residency redesign, especially with regard to how do we protect the specialty of general surgery, we felt we need more data. So hopefully we'll have something to share with people at some point in the near future from that collaboration.
Great. Bruce?
So, yes, question for Dr. Beiske. Joe, so our resident takes the board's written exam after the 4th year. He's now board eligible.
Those are not necessarily the same thing.
Okay, okay. Does that mean the 5th year would certainly be not ACGME funded? And, or is there any potential that a credentialing committee at the institution would allow that person to operate independently?
So I think that is something that's talked about a lot, and I think it's pie in the sky. If you're going to say they have to have more training before they can really be certified, then you can't declare them able to be autonomous. Well, you can. I'm going to take a step back and say you can invoke entrustable professional activities, which is something we have not pursued very aggressively, but is something that we didn't even touch on that today. You know, that you might be able to, over time, develop something where they can say they can autonomously do a hernia repair. They can autonomously do a gallbladder repair, sort of limited autonomy. That doesn't exist now, and that's a whole other arm. So what we approved was for residents to take the qualifying exam. Nothing else. That doesn't mean that they are admissible to the certifying exam. It's one other step, just like they have to take FLS and pass it. So you have to take your qualifying exam before you take your certifying exam. We're going to let them take it a year earlier. To me, that's a different mindset, and I think it's interesting to see whether you can compress all of the requirements into 4 years, but it's not the same as declaring yourself to be eligible. There is a whole group of people who are sort of working down that pathway. Take the qualifying exam, declare yourself to be autonomous, have a required year of autonomy before you move on to certification. That seems less likely to be successful to me.
I would just add to those comments, I think, and I think I definitely fall more to the side of Lee. My parents would confirm that about the rule-breaking piece. But I think this is a huge challenge because unless we allow ourselves to break some rules, and that's going to have to really come from the highest levels of leadership. As we looked into doing the exact innovation you suggested, Bruce, using EPAs, using milestones to say if after their 4th year they took their exam, they could be credentialed for independent graduated responsibilities for practice, which is a key principle that the board has been operating behind. The challenge, we said we'll give back our DME, our IME caps. It turns out, not the issue. There's a separate CMS regulation that says as long as you're in an ACGME training pathway, that you cannot bill independently. So then that stops the discussion with the hospital if you're going to break that and give money back. So I know Tom Nasker from the ACGME is having discussions with CMS about this, but changing a CMS reg is a lot harder than changing our own House of Surgery regs. So I hope going forward we can think about using some of this serial assessment to get to a place where we say after 4 years, if you've met certain benchmarks, you still could stay within the safety net of your training program, but outside of the ACGME pathway and have that sort of an experience, because I think that allows us then to get where we really want to be, which is to make sure that we have a safe surgeon population when we're finished. Over here.
Hi, my name is Raj Agarwal. I'm at McGill University. The first thing is I'm really excited about this because having read the Blue Ribbon report in 2004, something's actually happening now. So that's fantastic. Thank you. Just a couple of reflections, though. Yes, I trained in the UK, and it's a much longer training period, but my last 3 years of training, I exclusively did foregut surgery. That's all I did apart from take call. And so I didn't need to do a fellowship. I just, came out, and that was that. The second reflection is when I was at Penn, I had a chief resident who already had a cardiac surgery fellowship, and he's spending 2 months with me doing bariatric surgery. I mean, that to me was just mindless, and to him as well. So, this is great that this is actually happening. The point I wanted to make, which really leads to what Lee was saying in terms of the American board and the examinations, in the UK, the model is the fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons. You have the examinations, whether it's the written paper or whether it's the equivalent of the certifying exam, which is 50% in terms of surgery, but then the other 50% you actually say what your specialty is. So half my examination was in upper GI surgery. Could be colorectal, could be plastics. And then my certification from the Royal College is the Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, brackets, upper GI surgery. And I wonder if that's been considered, and I'm sure you've looked at the UK model, but I think maybe it's worth looking at it from the ACGME and ABS perspective too.
Joe, did you want to respond to that?
I feel myself exhausted by talking about modularity and testing. Someone else want to answer that?
That is being discussed, and as I kind of briefly mentioned and showed in that slide, there's some, the ABS likes to work with specialty societies to get expert weigh-in. It's kind of a mixture. We like a mixture of non-experts to make sure that questions aren't too difficult. I think at least conceptually it would be possible to make modules within different disciplines to represent the 23 specialties that Frank. How people would get to choose that, and your parentheses could be quite long if you added all 23 modules, and what would that really mean to the public has to be carefully thought through and will take a while. So should there be a global GI surgery? What does that contain? Bariatric, HPB, whatever is going to have some politics within specialty societies. The public may get confused. The board shies away from what happened to plastic surgery and kind of the multitude of different certificates that was confusing the public. So it's a good thought. Probably functionally will happen that way. The test questions will be designed in a block, but I think it has to be aggregated in a certain way, and that's a complicated issue.
I think hopefully we move away, though, from thinking about the assessment as being a written exam. And I hope we think about a much more creative way to determine if somebody is competent. We keep talking about writing questions, but my personal belief is that's not going to be the assessment model, hopefully.
Well, one of the things I hope you noticed when I pointed out is that the question part of it is just a small part of it. The part of it's what you've done to qualify, and that's set by specialty societies. What you need to do to qualify to even take the exam is really kind of the core element. I mean, how many cases did you do? How'd you do them? What did your peers think about you? What did your program director think about you? Did you finish a curriculum? What were your milestones? And then the exam is just kind of the end product.
But I think that summative process could be different than a written exam. I think Joe spoke a lot about that at our consensus conference recently, and hopefully we'll be innovative as we think about that. I think over here.
Prashant Sen at NYU. So I was thinking back to an era that predates me, which is the old model of the pyramidal system. And I'm wondering if some element of what we learned back then, the good and the bad, can be applied to getting to that fourth year and then deciding who gets to go on to a fifth year of highly specialized training. Not all residents are created equal. Not all of them are going to have the interest. That's not a bad thing. To go on into complex foregut surgery or hepatobiliary surgery. And in effect, I can tell you from our own residents, there are some who are just spectacular and have demonstrated dedication and an interest, both cognitively and technical proficiency, and are able to then do independently portions of complex surgeries. And should we be looking at those, understanding very well that there are market forces that are going to drive down that number? Should we look at those market forces and then employ what we've learned from that sort of pyramidal model to really pick out the ones that we let go in that direction? And that's one part of my question. The second part of my question is, for those people who are truly interested in becoming a broad-minded general surgeon, I guess, first of all, we have to understand what the society's needs are. But then can we pair those individuals and send them out to the community using market forces like locum tenens postings and people desperate, putting $500, $600, $7,000, $100,000 job postings for the middle of nowhere, quote unquote. And then do we find a good candidate who, surgeon qualified, going out to those positions and pairing them up in an apprentice model for that fifth year?
I could take a stab at that. So your latter question first. That's what the Transitions to Practice program really is that the college has developed, and Dr. Lewis mentioned it briefly this morning. I think there's 13 participant programs now, but 40 apparently will be coming on board in the near future. And that's really meant to take that person who desires a practice, perhaps even with that group, and brings them on for a year. In some places that's the design. In other places they're sort of prepping them for a practice somewhere else. So we'll see how that model works. Your idea about going back to sort of the pyramidal system, I'd have to think about it further, but my first reaction is that we already have some concerns as a specialty that we are having trouble attracting the best and the brightest to surgery. They're all going to EM, dermatology, et cetera. If they knew that their odds of getting to do what they want to do were based on some pyramidal system, I think we'd have an even bigger problem recruiting the best and the brightest. That's just my thought.
Tony Petrick from Geisinger. Hey, Lee, relative to certification, you know, the ASMBS does offer a certification for the non-ACGME bariatric fellowships, and I don't know if your omission was intentional or there's something. I guess my question is, what's the perspective of the Fellowship Council of the board on that certification? Is that a model, or is there some flaw with that that makes us think that's not a good way to go?
Yeah, I mean, HPBA certifies fellows as well, so it certainly exists out there. I guess I'm talking about the next level of having board of surgery verification of that.
So ABS sanction.
Yeah, so kind of a more overarching mandated thing. I'm sure if this ever comes to that they'll take the HPBA and the ASMBS models and look very closely at them and may just validate them. I think their expertise, once again, that we keep talking about exams because, for good or bad, high stakes exams are kind of it, oral, whatever, and looking at different models. But the expertise of the Board of Surgery is high stakes exams, and I think that that would have to be closely looked at how high stakes it'd have to be carefully analyzed. That's kind of Joe's.
I think there's value to having a uniform certificate. So the ASMBS has been part of these discussions. They came to the meeting in August talking about unified standards for all fellowships. And so there's an ABS certificate. There's a certificate of completion of FLS. You know, in the early 90s, you could get a certificate of completion for your weekend course for laparoscopy, and none of that means anything to someone who doesn't know what it means. It's confusing to the public. It's confusing to the payers. It's confusing to the hospital credentialing committees. So the more we can standardize things, the stronger we are as a unified voice. So nothing wrong with the ASMBS certificate, and no requirement that you join in any kind of additional board ABS initiative, but we think that a larger group standing together and meeting the same set of standards, which you may well already be meeting, is ideal.
So right now, the board's not really ready to look at those certificates and move to another level and so sort of endorse those in any way? Because I know we've had conversation over the last couple of years.
So Lee mentioned that briefly in his talk, and I was remiss in not mentioning it a little bit more in mind. So the ABS is bound to abide by the rules, because I like rules, of the ABMS, which is the oversight of all 24 medical specialty boards. And so one of their rules is that unless it's ACGME accredited, you cannot certify it. So I'm the head of a task force now looking into changing that rule, essentially. And it wouldn't be frank certification, it would be added recognition.
Or, yeah, some
and so we're not even allowed to do that. And to comment on what Raj said before, we're not allowed to have certificates that say and. The certificates have to be universal. We have an ABS certificate. It's not ABS and foregut. It's not ABS and anything else. It's one certificate, which is why we don't have modular exams, because we don't think it's fair to have a modular, to hide everybody under one rubric. So I think the ABMS, so when the decision by the ABMS has to apply to all specialties, so it moves a little bit more slowly. And I think that they're going to say yes, because it matches how practice and education happens in this country. So it's going to come, last I heard, it's going to come to a vote in front of the ABMS either in the fall or in January. As Lee charged the Fellowship Council to start being prepared for the idea of a 4+2 fellowships, the ABS is preparing for the idea of recognizing all these additional specialties, and we'll be lined up and ready to start when the ABMS approves it, which I think is likely to happen.
And I think that just to add to exactly what Joe said, I think that in the feedback we have gotten is that this is, at least to the U.S. trainees, this is very valuable to them as well, because this carries weight for them and is desirable. So we have 5 minutes left, so if we can just ask people to keep their questions brief, and we'll try to keep our responses brief, and we'll just take those to the microphone now.
Okay,
John?
sorry, I'll be quick. John Lee from the Brigham. Looking at how confusing and complex this is, we're trying to account for the residents that are in training now, but if I step back and look at the 20-year view, are we going to get to the point where med students are just going to pick the specialty that they want right out of med school and go straight like ortho does and neurosurgery does? CT is starting to do it. We just started the I6 program where they come out of med school doing it. And it doesn't, urology pretty much does it. It doesn't seem to be that far-fetched for med students as I want to be a hepatobiliary surgeon, and the specialty boards have a training program based on that. What do you feel?
So I'm smiling because you're talking to the converted about this. We talk as though your life opportunities should be open to you forever. That I should still be able to be an Olympic gymnast. The door should never shut behind you. Can I still? Whereas in almost every other field, people decide when they're 20. Why shouldn't you be able to decide when you're, say, 27, what you want to do for the rest of your life? And if you want to change your mind, then you start over again. I'm completely fine with that, but that has not been the sort of group policy. It's sort of keeping things open for longer. But I do think we do see other specialties peeling off and grabbing people out of medical school. The other side of that is that a lot of specialties medical students aren't exposed to. So they're not exposed to transplant surgery. They'll never pick it. How will we get transplant surgeons if we have to pick it straight out of medical school?
I think med students, it's coming out of med school then to rotate them through those and get the exposure. So.
Yeah, but those are the two sides of that coin. But I do tend to agree with you.
Over here.
Hi, Joe Dodd, Nevada, Missouri. About 5 years ago, I transitioned from a tertiary high complexity practice to a rural practice, and in many ways, I was very prepared for it. And in other ways, not so much. There's not urology necessarily there all the time. Lee, I don't know if you were involved in the rural surgery tract at University of Oregon. We peripherally talked about it a little bit, and there's a difference in need in rural areas other than just a community-based general surgeon. Sometimes there's other specialty. The North Dakota tract, they even do ortho, and I imagine some other, minor urology things. There's a real need there, and what are we doing about that? And where does all this fit in?
Yeah, well, obviously the rural rotations are becoming increasingly popular. I think the push on program directors to do more flexible endoscopy was really a fire under that, because that's where surgeons do flexible endoscopy, is in rural practices. And I think part of the conception is if general surgery becomes a specialty, if there's a fellowship in general surgery, it'll probably be broken down into rural acute care for tertiary centers and different elements like that. So yeah, it's definitely, everybody knows that's a good thing because it familiarizes the resident, introduces them to that kind of practice, and hopefully they'll like it and go there and practice. But
one of the things that as I started paying more attention to rural surgery that was interesting to me is people talk about rural surgeons as though they do everything, that they sort of cover the entire waterfront of all of surgery because they have to. And we learned from the Shep Institute last time we met with them that most surgeons in this country do about 13 operations. And what those 13 are, if you're an endocrine surgeon, they're one set of 13. If you're a MIS surgeon, they're another set of 13. And rural surgeons also do about 13 operations. It just turns out that they include carpal tunnel and C-section and fractures. So it's not that they do everything, it's that they do a different subset. So that to me becomes a trainable idea. It's not this big amorphous, you have to be prepared to do absolutely everything. And then in the very end, of course, it's going to depend on your practice setting like it does everywhere. So there have to be opportunities for training throughout life, and actually SAGES is one of the opportunities for that, as Brian Duncan really focuses on telementoring as a potential way of reaching people for training further down their career. So I don't know, it was very helpful to me to understand that that is also a fairly constrained or defined practice. We didn't have to prepare people to be able to do absolutely everything. It was just different things.
Great. With that, we'll wrap up. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for our speakers.